Welcome everybody to our Fiercely Forward statewide summit. Thank you so much for your engagement today and specifically this evening. We are cozily by the fire on this warm, sultry summer evening, but we really do want to create a warm, inviting, welcoming atmosphere to have an informal conversation and talk through some of the reflections of the day. We focused on policy today and thinking through the policy of the future, future iterations of our work. Also talk about some of the policies that might not have gotten as much airtime today in terms of work that Equality Ohio is advancing at the State House or at the local level or in partnership with other organizations across the state. So my name is Elena Jochum. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm Executive Director of Equality Ohio, and just so grateful to be part of this conversation tonight. I'm going to pass it to my colleagues, Gwen Stembridge and Dominic Detweiler. Gwen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Elena, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm Gwen Stembridge, pronouns are she, her, and I get to serve as our statewide civic engagement director. And yeah, I'm just going to echo the excitement for the conversation tonight. This is really an opportunity for us to have some more open conversation. As you may have noticed, there's some intention with the structure of the Stakeholder Summit, and each day has a different theme. A different topic area to talk about, and then we also move from hearing from an expert in the morning and a presenter to a panel discussion. We're opening up the conversation to hear different perspectives. Then we have some identity caucuses where folks within specific identities can talk about how these issues are impacting their lives, and then this fireside chat where we are at the most informal of the day, and this is really a chance for us to sit and have conversation around some topics that we've heard come up over the year, and just want to really open up the conversation. So this is one of those where we are not here to present at you. We are here to ask some questions and really open up and have some dialogue together. So I just welcome you. Want to make sure that that is clear, that there is not, that your voice is welcome in the room, and your comments are welcome in the chat, whichever way you want to engage tonight. So I wanted to give folks just a little idea of some flow of this. We have some questions, some kind of guiding questions to ask. And we're going to start out with some introductions, but then we have some of those guiding questions. We may not get to all of them, and that's okay. The only goal of tonight's session is just to have a robust conversation together, and to really hear from stakeholders in this work. And so that's the goal for tonight. Dom, is there anything else you wanted to add?
I don't think I have much to add. I'll just introduce myself. My name is Dom Detweiler. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm our public policy strategist. So yeah, I spend a lot of time virtually anyway at the State House, and I'm really just excited for this conversation because I think this conversation is about the future of our policy work and what it means to advocate for LGBTQ folks, both at the State House, but also in city councils, and what policies we need to be looking at to be addressing the needs of our community. So I'm just really excited about this evening.
Thank you. So I'm gonna pass it to Elena to just give a little bit of context around some of the policies that Equality Ohio is working on, and that we know kind of other folks are working on. And to be clear here, we're focused on issues that particularly impact the LGBTQ community, but also we recognize that there are so many intersectional issues, and basically anything they're talking about at the State House or at your local city council is going to impact someone who is part of the LGBTQ community. So there's a little bit of narrowness to that, but but just recognizing that like all of those policies are impactful. So I'm going to pass it to Elena to just set us up and give us a little bit of context for this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gwen. And yeah, just a little bit of overarching context to get us also thinking about policy. So often you hear the Ohio Fairness Act, and that is like, yes, that is a key major piece of legislation, but it is not by any means the only piece of legislation that we at Equality Ohio work on or seek to advance or improve. It's just one, and there are other types of policies. We also have, so we have statewide legislation, and in that bucket, I'm just going to share a couple of the pieces that we focus on. First of all and foremost, defending and holding the line, defending the gains that we have made, and defending our community from being attacked by legislators of the State House. So examples of bills you may have heard in the past: the Pastor Protection Act, anti-transgender youth bills, either prohibiting kids from playing in sports, matching their gender identity, or banning them from medical or therapeutic care. Bills like we're seeing now that are trying to ban the teaching of critical race theory and certain forms of discussion of gender. Bills that are trying to restrict our right to protest. These are all bills that we work either on directly or in coalition with partners on. Also protecting kids against conversion therapy. That is a bill that we have worked on for many years, along with the Ohio Fairness Act. Other areas that we recognize: updating our code to recognize queer families. Most of our laws were just simply not built with LGBTQ families in mind, and we know that our legal clinic runs into issues with that. Hopeful if folks have stories of that here, they might be able to share and identify any particular policy difficulties you've run into in that area. And then another bucket of work that just to get our minds thinking in terms of policies is agency work. Agencies actually impact our daily lives in so many ways. We don't even think of them necessarily as policy sometimes. Think about getting your basic identity documents, your driver's license. That's the BMV. That policy is something that Equality Ohio has helped to improve over many years in coalition with partners and continues to, so that folks can get accurate identity documents reflecting who they are. So other areas in there where we do work, improving Ohio's foster care policies, improving our juvenile justice systems, collecting data that will inform policy changes to better treat LGBTQ youth that we know are significantly disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system, improving the judiciary to better treat LGBTQ Ohioans within any aspect of our legal system. We know our legal system is really challenging. How can we make it better for queer litigants overall? So these are just some of the examples of ideas of policy, and really want to invite this open to discussion. Gwen, I don't know if you have a specific way that we're going to go about this tonight, but I'm going to kick it back to you after giving those as some chewy examples for us to be thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think we'll start out just the first question to kind of guide our evening is, what policies are you aware of that impact LGBTQ Ohioans? And that those could be policies that you know are being worked on, or policies that you know are not being worked on. Just kind of what are you aware of within that landscape? And so the way we'll do this is just when you speak, if you'll introduce yourself and just share your name and pronouns and maybe what part of the state you're in, or if you're here representing a certain organization, that'd be great. So we'll kind of do introductions like that as folks bring their voice into the room. So start out, I'll say that question again, and then I'll put it in the chat. But it's, what policies are you aware of that impact LGBTQ Ohioans?
Mika, is it in the chat? Yeah, Mika is talking about HIV laws and some of the work that we've been doing around modernization of the HIV criminal laws, which is work that we're really excited about and should be getting off the ground here more publicly very soon.
Yeah, Mika, it's been incredible to see the coalition around that of such diverse, wonderful partners across the state and led by people living with HIV/AIDS to modernize Ohio's laws. If folks were in the earlier session today, we learned that it is a status, it is a crime in certain circumstances to simply be living with HIV and AIDS. I mean, that is just so hard to believe in 2021 that that is where we are, but that is where we are. And so this is working to decriminalize, to modernize our laws, to not make that be the case.
Move to another question if that may solicit some more conversation. And I also, those of you who are not able to be on video or anything like that, please, if you add questions or reflections in the chat, we're happy to read those aloud, and then so everybody can partake in the conversation. I think this next question is about how did you become aware of policies? Like, what are your resources? Are you one of the folks who watches the Ohio channel and watches every state house hearing, or are you a person who is subscribed to a bunch of do you get a bunch of text messages from different organizations, keeping you in the loop on when it's time to call your legislators, or is there a particular issue that you are just really a subject matter expert in that you stay focused on and stay researched? Kind of how do you get your information and how do you become aware of those policies? And I can kind of kick it off by saying, like, I didn't have a lot of those resources until I started doing this work in those spaces. I feel like there are just constantly things coming at you and all of these like HB, SB, and it's all changing all the time. And I really, before being on staff at Equality Ohio, really relied on organizations like Equality Ohio and NARAL and Ohio Environmental Council and like so many others who I know are tracking this and who I trust and can give me that information, and I can just make the call with a quick script or whatever I need to do. But yeah, organizations and those texts for me.
Also inviting folks to share, have you been within a system and bumped into a block? Have you been in some situation where a policy was not adapted for you and harmed you, or you could see being challenging or a barrier to someone in the future because of their LGBTQ identity? That's another way to think of this question.
I'm seeing some pieces in the chat about keeping one of our piece of our website open, and then some other folks have been saying like that all these policies impact LGBTQ Ohioans.
I think that's something that's really true though, is that like we are LGBTQ folks, but we're also just like people living in the world as well. So like all of the policies that are being debated at all of these levels are going to impact our lives in some way or another. And I think like that's really why we wanted to have this conversation, was how do we, in an ideal world, right, where we have infinite capacity, we're working on all of those things. But that's not the world we live in. So like figuring out how as a movement we prioritize those things is a really important conversation, and maybe we can loop that into the conversation this evening. But I think that that's kind of one of the things that, at least in my mind, really prompted this conversation.
And welcome folks who are just joining. We're talking about just how we've engaged with policies, how we've learned about certain policies that we follow, just kind of how do you engage in all of that? Yeah, Sam, you raised your hand.
Yeah, sorry. I don't even know why I raised my hand. I guess I just didn't want to like interrupt if somebody started talking. Anyways, in terms of policy, I'm currently in school, so I engage with policy a lot that way. In terms of research and academic literature, I also I read a lot about future policy implications, right? Like I read a lot about not current policy, not policy that's currently being discussed or even on the table, but what could future policy look like and what should current policy look like? And so that's a way in which I come into policy a lot is looking at policy formation and it through an academic lens with research to back it up, and looking at it from a lens of this is what could happen in an idealistic world, and this is the research supporting it and this is what we should be doing, but also the understanding that research has its own limitations. I also recently got introduced to the Ohio channel. Thank you to EO. So starting to look at that. But I think for me and maybe a lot of young adults who might be students as well, I get a lot of policy like introduction and just, like working alongside it in a lot of academic research, because I think every good paper, especially if it's like a piece of like sociology or any type of work that is in regards to human development and human success, essentially, has really good policy implications at the end of it. Because what would the research be for if to not change policy? So I think that's where like I come into contact with it the most. And then like I go out and do my own research to see like, hey, is this being talked about in our community right now? Is this actually being talked about within our legislative branch, or is this just something that a professor from Harvard said this would be good to do? So I think that's where I come into contact a lot with it.
And what a great point you brought in about research and that idea of research sometimes telling us what policy should change. We definitely have experienced talking to legislators about a very real lived experience. Like, let's also be very clear, just because you don't have a research paper or a data point on it does not diminish your experience with a system. And a legislator says, well, how do I take this to my colleagues? And sometimes they ask for research. So that's another question that we could ask for here. What areas have you found that need some more research, perhaps, to document systematically some of the lived experiences that we know are happening? Examples that we briefly touched on was data around the fact we know in our minds that there are more LGBTQ youth in juvenile justice systems. We just know it. And nobody had ever documented it. One of the projects Kim Welter is working on with 5 counties is documenting that disproportionate experience of LGBTQ folks in youth systems so that policies can be addressed to change that, but have the data behind it. If folks have ideas about other areas where that research is, that lived experience is real, but research could be helpful, that's something that would be great to share in this space too.
And I also want to add to that, I think it's important to know that research, it sometimes can be fickle, right? Like we have all these limitations, and especially with children, right? Like we can't always research everything we want to because of the ethics behind it, which is unfortunate, because it's like we could have greater policy if we could research things in certain ways that would probably give us the answer we need. But due to ethics, like containing information, especially about a child, like where they go to school, what their school is like, stuff like that, like certain demographics, it's harder to do that. But I think our legislatures not only need to use research, but as Mika mentioned in the chat, storytelling is very powerful. And due to colonialism, we've lost the art of storytelling and oral tradition, because it's no longer seen as an academic treasure, right? It's no longer viewed as an optimal source. But we know that through storytelling and through dialogue that you learn a lot, and that's a way in which we can learn, and it doesn't have to be a research article. So I think in tandem with research, we need to go back to organic storytelling and oral history and tradition, because even though research might not show it, lived experiences, anecdotes, those are just as powerful and can aid in the development of policy that can better serve our community, because who knows better what to do for our community than someone in the community, right? Like no one who's not living this experience, they couldn't make policy accurate enough without the lived experiences and the stories of individuals who are sharing it. And so that's just as important. So a lot of qualitative data is needed as well, and we don't need to rely on numbers as much. And I think that would also open up more doors for policy implementation and development. So.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. Do folks have other experience? And I guess the next question this kind of leads into is what are those steps that you've taken towards policy change, or what are things that you've seen that worked well? What actions have you taken? What are you willing to take? There's a little bit also in this question of, for folks who were able to join this morning, our first session of the day was about movement ecology and how we are living in this ecology. And just like we need bees to pollinate the plants, that the birds eat, and then I'm going to mess this up, but because it's been a while since I've had biology, but right, that there's this chain and we're all connected here, right? And we need each other to survive and to thrive. Also within our movement, we need folks who are showing up to the State House, who are doing direct action. And we also need folks who are putting on a suit and lobbying, right? We also need folks who are making change within the businesses where they work, and who are working in the nonprofit field, and right there, and also folks who are saying, you know, forget all this, I'm just gonna create my own alternative system, right? We need all of those lanes, and we need to be in communication and in relationship with one another, so that we can really move, I'm gonna be cheesy, fiercely forward together, right? So I guess this question, now that I've said all that, is what are some of those steps that you've taken toward policy change, or what is the lane that you work in, and maybe a little bit about why, if you want to share that.
While folks are thinking about that, I think it'd be good for us to address this comment that Justin brought up in the chat. Justin says, there are so many outlandish and facially unlawful proposals coming from state legislators. It's hard to know what is being proposed for point scoring by a given legislator, or what is a real threat to our community. Yeah, this is something that we have to balance and figure out every day. I think I'm going to turn your comment around a little bit, Justin, and say that the fact that legislators think that they can score points off of attacking our community is in itself harmful. That's not an answer to your comment there, but I think that is something that we especially see with these anti-trans youth bills, is that the mere existence of these bills is harmful for LGBTQ young people, because they see elected people who are supposed to be representing them, attacking them, bullying them from this high position that they've been given at the state legislature. Maybe a more direct response to that would be that, like, just from our experience in the State House over the last couple of years, those things are also one and the same, where they weren't necessarily last General Assembly, where there was this kind of fringe anti-LGBTQ group that was attacking us, but their attacks never really had any traction. We're not in that place anymore. Those pieces of legislation are being taken very seriously, and are getting movement and are being discussed in such a way that, like, there is a real threat that they pass. The ban on transgender athletes is probably the best example of that. And like, this is a big shift for us organizationally and as a state. We really haven't had successful expressly anti-LGBTQ legislation in a really long time. And that could very well change this General Assembly. There are a wide variety of reasons for that we can probably have a whole nother conference about. But there's an extent to which, like, if it's introduced, it is real and a threat in a way that it wasn't even last year, where we could say that those bills weren't going to be taken seriously, because they are.
And Justin, your question raises, the first part of it, it talks about blatantly unconstitutional, like, so correct. So many of these proposed bills that are outlandish are blatantly going to be challenged as unconstitutional. And we know that some pieces of legislation, frankly, are being put forward to have those judicial fights. And that has been really frustrating, because we do see that as a pathway for some folks who are really trying to get bad court case decisions that will harm the LGBTQ community too. And you're right, I think it is a balance. Which ones can you stop at the State House? Which ones do we think will go through? And ultimately, we will have to rely on the courts to protect us. And that's a lane too. Maybe this can be helpful for our conversation. Is there a time when you, as an advocate, chose one lane for one piece of policy work and a different lane for another? I have happily protested with signs in front of City Hall so many times. I have also been in the courtroom challenging a procedure from the legal system. And then in this role with Equality Ohio, often doing lobbying as my particular role within the organization. What lanes have folks engaged in policy, and what was that experience like?
I know when I think about that, working in different lanes, sometimes direct action is the only option. We are lucky, I guess, in some ways, to, even though the Ohio Fairness Act is way overdue, that it even it can get introduced as a bill, right? There are some of these issues, especially around policing, that wouldn't have not at this point gotten the kind of progress that we've seen with the Ohio Fairness Act and the kind of normal, common, like considered normal, right? Common awareness. And so sometimes the only option for some of those things is direct action and is marching in the streets, because it's not taken in those spaces, not taken as seriously. Yeah. Gio shared speaking in city council meetings, and let me tell you, that is where so much work happens. Local work is so important, and so often our city councils are not aware that they have LGBTQ constituents. So I will just encourage folks, if you have not been to your city council meeting before, find out when it is. You can go. A lot of times these days there is a Zoom available, especially as some of these pandemic procedures continue on. So yeah, check those out, see what's happening. Sometimes it's boring tree lawn stuff, but sometimes it's really juicy. So I encourage you to check those out. I'm gonna read a couple other comments here from folks. MD shared that they engage with policy by introducing potential allies to the subject and asking them for direct support. That's organizing. And they said for themselves personally, direct action, art, activism. Oh my gosh, the arts are so powerful in this. And by making tons and tons of calls. And sometimes that's where it is. And then, yeah, Gio said speaking at city council meetings and at protests. And then Kim shared being out and volunteering, her personal story for folks who don't know LGBTQ people personally, changing hearts and minds one person at a time. Yeah, all of those lanes are really important. Do any of you want to elaborate on any of that? I wanted to just make sure it got out there, but I'd love for you to elaborate if you're up for it.
I'll jump in and elaborate. So prior to coming on staff at EO, definitely was collaborating with EO on the ordinance in Akron and able to kind of speak to city council, just them directly, but then also at the city council meeting in front of other constituents, because that's often something we hear within the community from other community members, that like those things don't happen here and they don't affect LGBTQ identified individuals. So being able to do that, but then also speaking at protests. I've spoken at a lot of various protests, those for the LGBTQ plus community specifically, and then some for like Black Lives Matter and whatnot. And so just really being able to be authentic and be vocal is extremely important.
I'd be really interested to see how people kind of filter through everything that exists in the kind of policy universe, and like what your process is for determining how and to what extent you get involved in various things. Our issues are among an entire universe of issues for folks to care about, to engage with. And I think we're going to talk about this on Friday too, but we all hold many intersectional identities as well that like are impacted in different ways by different pieces of policy. So how do you sift through all of the content? I mean, Mika, I think, said something about getting information about policy from social media. And like, there is just so much going on. It's like so much information coming in. How do folks go about sifting through that?
I'll take this question. The very first board I was asked to be on was actually for a wolf sanctuary, because I'm very passionate about endangered species, especially wolves. But I knew if I got involved in that movement, I would get too mad and too angry, and I wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And I might get violent, and I'm not a violent person. So I'm like, I'm just going to give you money. You go do what you need to do. And now I focus on where my expertise lies, where I think I can make the biggest difference. For example, one of the elections I worked, everybody in Kentucky was mad at me because I didn't work in Kentucky where I live. I worked in Ohio because Ohio was actually going to make a difference potentially. That's where the work was needed. I wanted to go for some of the pipeline protests, but that was travel. I couldn't be there, but I knew other amazing activists were doing that work. I can support them. So it's I hate to use a capitalistic term, but it's return on investment. Where can I make the most difference with my resources? And where are we most likely to make change? And where do we have to put small investments? Because some of those changes we want aren't going to come for decades, but we need to put the work in now so that future generations can enjoy the benefits.
Similarly to Jen saying that, I started my own nonprofit, and that was a way to do it sometimes when you're not able to kind of do what you feel like needs to be done in other systems or within other organizations. If you have the drive and the ability, you just do your own thing and you just start your own. And for me, that was a very active lane to be in a way to kind of change things. So yeah.
I would add parenting is totally a lane as well, raising the next generation. So I know there's several parents on this too that are also here in the evening balancing supper time, and I'm sure all the other things that are happening. So just shout out to you all who are also parenting. That is 1000% a lane.
What a beautiful illustration of the full movement ecology, just even in all of the actions that we have shared from this morning. This is really amazing.
It's the translation often from Elena and I talk about this often. I'm like, Elena, that's in legalese. Can you say that in my language or whatever? And it's that translation, right? Because we get stuck with our jargon and everything, and it's about how do we make this accessible to people. So that's really key. And I wanted to also just lift up the Amanda put in the chat a little bit ago. about including quick current events, FYI moments in the trainings that she's doing. So how can we like incorporate those little spaces to give those updates, or to transfer that information in spaces where we already are, and so that it becomes part of the habit of things. Yeah, that's really important. I think things like I noticed things like the Facebook asking you who you want to donate to for your birthday, right? Becomes like it's a thing that you do, right? You're going to post, or somebody's going to post on your Facebook page anyway. You might as well use that to donate, right? Or you have friends over for a barbecue or a fire, and right, hey, can we all pitch in $5 to something, right? How can we incorporate those things into what we're already doing? I have one more question here, or just kind of the next question. What does it mean to have a race equity lens when working on policies that impact the LGBTQ community in Ohio? This is something that Equality Ohio has been working on. Our strategic framework has a really strong race equity lens, and that's part of our it's part of our strategic framework going forward, part of our mission and vision and everything going forward. So I just wanted to hear from folks. I'll put that question in the chat. But what does it mean to have a race equity lens when working on policies that impact LGBTQ plus community members in Ohio?
I think to have a race equity lens, one, it's very important, right? Because we know that if you're a part of the LGBTQ plus community, you might have a shared experience of being a part of that community, but there are significant differences when you are of a different race, a different social class, a different background, everything like that, right? So when having a race equity lens, when it comes to policy in regards to the LGBTQ plus community, it's important because the policy that has been implemented, right? Like the small amount that's been implemented, we know benefits white people extremely. Like, let's look at policy just in a larger sense, right? We know that it greatly benefits white people. And so when you get even more narrow and you're talking specifically LGBTQ plus, policy, though it might be exclusionary to LGBTQ plus people, it is still accepting if they're white. And so knowing that intersectionality and knowing that there's a different experience when you are a queer person of color, a trans person of color. And even within that lens, there's a difference when you are trans and you're Black. There's a difference when you're queer and you're Black. There's a difference when, you're a queer Black woman, right? So you throw gender into that. So when looking at policy, you have to have a racial equity lens because there are different needs of different communities. And due to systemic racism, sexism, and any other ism that holds a person back because of their identity, we want equity to be at the forefront of anything that we want to implement. Because there's that example where it's like watching a baseball game, right? And there's that gate. And it's like, equality would be, we both get the same ladder. But I'm short and the person next to me is 6'5". They don't even need a ladder. I'm 5'2". I literally would need the ladder. And it's like, I get that it's equal that we both got a ladder, but what's equitable, right? Giving them, like allowing them to utilize their privilege, which is their height, and giving me a ladder so I can also see it. But then also there's that extra step of going beyond equity and it's justice. And it's like removing that systemic barrier that holds me back or any minority back in its entirety, thus making it both equitable and fair and just for all parties. And so when we want to implement policy, we want to talk policy and we want to talk change, you have to go into the mindset of this policy, yes, it is good, but is it good for the entire community? Because if whatever you're trying to uplift doesn't uplift your quote unquote smallest person, then it doesn't uplift anyone. Because if you leave one person out, you've left an entire group out and you've left so many people out. And so when we look at policy, we need to always think of what community needs this the most and what do they need the most. because everything else will trickle, right? Everything else will find its way and it'll plug in, because once you're inclusive of those who need the most inclusivity, everyone else falls in line. And so that's why it's important to have a racial equity lens when looking at policy, especially within our community, because we know racism is so deeply embedded within all systems, regardless if you are a person who is LGBTQ+, like colorism, racism, prejudice, discrimination does not escape you just because you're a part of another community. It's still something you have to unlearn and actively be anti and against. So that's just kind of my thoughts on it.
You're so casual about those are kind of my thoughts. Those are like big, beautiful thoughts, Sam. Just like name that real quick. Like those are really crucial. Yeah, Siobhan shared the race equity lens reminds us of the water that we're all swimming in and lose sight of. That was a piece this morning in the session about movement ecology, that a fish was turning to another fish and saying, "Oh, isn't this water great?" And the fish is like, "We're in water? What?" And you don't notice it if you're in a river or a stream or wherever else you are, if you're not confronted with the experience of someone else. If you don't hear those stories like we were talking about, then you don't know what those issues are, and if you don't think outside of your own box. Any other thoughts on this race equity lens piece?
I think maybe it would be good for us to maybe provide an example that has come up in the work already. And I think one that I go to a lot is when we have conversations about hate crimes legislation with legislators. Because I think this is something that broadly, I think we've been talking about for a while, especially since the federal bill was passed. But it's not something that we've chosen to really engage with, largely because we know that hate crimes laws are actually not enforced equitably and are also enforced disproportionately against people of color. And I think that sometimes that is off-putting to legislators when we have that conversation, because they go into the experience expecting us to be really supportive and expecting us to toot their horn for introducing that. And I think that's probably the most prominent example that we've run into in the last couple months is not supporting a policy just because it's what's been done other places, but because it really does support our mission of passing policy that is good for LGBTQ folks, but also that is going to uplift everyone. And I think if we were, I'm not sure if that's helpful, but if we're looking for a specific example of how that has impacted our work so far, that's the first one that comes to mind.
I think another example that feeds into this particular moment that we're experiencing, these attempts to try to ban the teaching of certain ways of discussing race, like critical race theory or the 1619 Project, or certain ways that we talk about gender. We have been adamantly pushing against that with a united front of other partners because it's dangerous. It's dangerous that very framing of racism is, oh, I'm swimming in water. And if you ban the idea of realizing that we have white supremacy all around us, that literally stops the conversation of us advancing towards equity, the way that Sam was talking about. So that's another bill that has cropped up that we have not seen that legislative approach before, and are really pushing hard against.
I would add one more element actually to the conversation about policy, and so we can talk about how policy impacts the LGBTQ community. We could talk about how policy impacts people of color and LGBTQ people of color. But I've also grown concerned about how, about the accessibility issue, right? And whether or not actual LGBTQ people of color are in the room, right, when talking about policy, or even have kind of a road into into the advocacy spaces in general. And I guess what I have in my mind, so I come from the Puerto Rican community, like closer to Cleveland, and that's where some of my roots are. And I ended up working for a short time as a legislative aide in our Senate, Ohio Senate. And I realized when getting that job that I had so many internalized, almost at the cultural level, or social level, at the social level, these internalized access barriers, where I felt like policy legislators, these are not things that are accessible to me. These are not things that are in my reach. And even found myself when I was in the same space as legislators, almost like not wanting to look them directly in the eye, or not address them directly, and almost had to get over this sense of personal barrier and realize, oh, these are normal people. I can talk to my boss. I can talk to them. And then, of course, I was in that space for work, and I had a family member that had passed away, and our legislature provides, you can request a condolence letter from your senator. And I did that and sent a letter, and I had family, right, who then, and I told them it was coming, and they received this letter that looks all official, right, from their senator for our family member that had passed away. And at the next family reunion that I had, so many of my family members came up to me and were like, how did you swing that? How did you get that done? How did you, when in actuality, it was very simple. It's actually, you can, any person in Ohio can literally just email their legislature and ask them. And that's not even policy, like that's just asking for a letter, right? But I think what it showed me is, wow, my community is so, like, feels, at least, and the experience is that our position is already so disconnected from the world of policy, from the policy makers. And so I think this has to be an element too in the conversation of how do we close that gap. And there's an access issue in general when it comes to actually even getting feedback from the interested parties, from the communities that are most impacted by policy.
Such a beautiful example, Joseph. Yep. And it takes organizers often to make those connections happen, right? That is the role of advocacy organizations and of organizers, and in those spaces, is making those connections. So this next question is about like, what policies do you see that might be missing from the movement, or missing from the work in some ways? Are there things that you know of from community members you've talked with? Are there things that you're seeing in other places? What policies are missing? And then kind of along with that, where do you see policy change happening that's having the largest impact on your life, both positively or negatively?
Well, I kind of want to put Joseph's example in like a real life, like I want to bring it to life, right? So I'm still very much learning, but like that's where the disconnect is at, right? Like not like being part of a community that doesn't have the access to policy, what policy is going on, what to even look for. Like I wish I could give you an answer of like, what do I see? And it's like, I'm just starting to learn more about it. And so I think that shows how even into adulthood, our communities, especially communities of color or more disadvantaged communities, whether it be because of race or socioeconomic status or ability or anything, that we still go into adulthood having this disconnect. And so we don't even get to see or recognize what's missing until we know that oh, there's a way for me to find out that it's missing. Like, I know it's not there because obviously I'm being impacted by it, but like, I don't even know what to say. And so I think the question you pose, when it's for certain communities, I think that might be hard to answer, because say I say like, oh, this policy is missing, and someone's like, oh, that already exists. And it's like, well, is it being implemented then? Because if it does exist, how is it not impacting the community it was created for, right? And so I guess I just wanted to throw that out there, that when we ask these questions too, we have to be mindful that the questions we ask also might not have an answer, because if people don't have the access to it because of that disconnect, especially like at a cultural level, or any type of other barriers, like, you're not going to get a clear answer, because it's like, I don't know what I don't know, because I don't know how to ask. I don't know where to go to ask. I don't know where to go to look. So I think I just wanted to point that out. Like, that's a real life example of what Joseph was just talking about. Like, I don't know what policies out there because I don't know where to look, because growing up, it was never something that was talked about in my community. It was never something that we focused on. We're people of survival. We're not people of how do we make the future better. We're people of, I need to live right now. And I think you will find that very common in a lot of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, a lot of cultural minorities, because we've had to live in survival mode a lot. So that was just something else to think about as well, like when we ask these types of questions.